It's Women's History Month, and at Wikimedia UK, we're celebrating the great women and initiatives that are closing the gender gap on Wikipedia and its sister projects. Today, we're talking to Ewan McAndrew, the Wikimedian in residence at the University of Edinburgh, and the students involved in the projects closing the gender gap on Wikipedia and its sister projects.
Hi, my name is Ewan and I work as the Wikimedian in residence at the University of Edinburgh, supporting our key institutional commitments to supporting staff and students learning about how information is created, curated and contested online, and important commitments to developing information literacy, open knowledge, digital skills and equality and diversity.
I'm Sean. I'm a first year PhD candidate at the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at Edinburgh University. And I'm really excited to be part of this project and specifically focusing on widening Wikipedia's content on Black history and Black Scottish history.
Hi, I'm Eleanor. I'm a PhD researcher exploring how online audiences reinterpret images of digitised art online, with a focus on social media spaces and also on Wikipedia. And I'm really looking forward to exploring how we can include more LGBTQ+ representation on the site as part of this project.
I'm a final year undergraduate student of politics and social policy. Also very excited to be working on this project, more specifically probably looking at women and gender and increasing the knowledge and spaces on Wikipedia that include the work that they've done using the archives.
How is your project tackling the gender gap on Wikipedia and its sister projects?
So at the University of Edinburgh, we see supporting students with learning about how information gets online is really a crucial part of their university journey, and supporting them to understand how they can be empowered knowledge activists. There are lots of pages online, but there are a lot of gaps and there are a lot of problems in representation online. And so we've been teaching students and staff that they can help improve that information online as part of their course of studies or as part of projects outside of those course of studies. So we run monthly workshops, and we've now run these for 5 years, which look at improving gender representation online, where we know on Wikipedia only 19% of biographies are about women. But we also have run lots of other projects looking at Islamic art and how non-Western art is represented online, and how reproductive biology topics and world Christianity topics, and working with all different course programs. And we've also worked with student societies like the Student History Society and Professor Diana Payton on a particular project last year looking at Scotland, slavery and Black history. And I think Shan can speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, I really enjoyed doing that project last year. And I remember when they sent the call out for it, the History Society, it just sounded really interesting. I'd never thought about editing a Wikipedia page before, or like how to do that. And I think it's so true, like it is just the first thing that you check naturally for lots of things. So it's a great place where you can try and like rectify some of those imbalances. And I like that the project was a mix of our own like research skills. So as a historian myself, like I was going to get to do some of that, but then also like practically using the skills to make these pages. So I made a page for Jean-Baptiste Philippe, who was a student at Edinburgh University in the 19th century. He was from Trinidad, and he was a campaigner against slavery and against racial inequalities. And he had made this pamphlet, and he was really quite prolific in the 19th century, and he was an alumni of Edinburgh University, but there was no Wikipedia page for him. So it was really cool to make that page. And I know others in the group did things like editing existing pages to add in bits and kind of keep pages up to date with the latest research that had been published about different figures So yes, I'm looking forward to kind of expanding on that and working more with different people in the university and making sure that their research into Scottish Black history is reflected on Wikipedia. Yeah.
I guess I got to know about this project from my friend Hannah, who worked with Wikimedia 2 summers ago. She did a lot of work, I think, and I believe won an award from what I actually know, one of you has told me, for her work with Wikipedia in allowing people to basically learn how to access it easier. She had a really fun time working with them, and then when this project kind of popped up, she was like, "Oh, you're interested?" And I said, "You know what? That sounds fantastic." I spent a lot of time in my degree just looking at inequalities in general. Literally of every form, class, race, gender, sexual orientation, like it's all kind of part of policy, and we look at kind of who's missing almost when you design these things. And I think that's what Wikipedia is kind of trying to do, is fill in the gaps of who's missing on Wikipedia and whose, you know, actions and lives haven't been documented in the same way. So I think having the opportunity to kind of work within the uni's archives, obviously, and in general, and fill in those gaps and recognise these people for their achievements is kind of fantastic, and I'm just really looking forward to doing that. Especially I'll probably be focusing a bit more on gender, just because that's what I studied a bit more over the course of my degree, and it's my area where I always seem to end up looking at gender inequalities wherever I go. So I think kind of looking and making space for women, as you said, like 19% of women on Wikipedia would be fantastic.
Just briefly, I have some background in working with LGBTQ plus inclusion in heritage and in education, which has got some links to my research looking at how LGBTQ plus audiences might be responding to digitized images of art, which plays into one of the strands of the project that we're doing here. So broadly speaking, we're looking to create new Wikipedia pages using content from the University of Edinburgh, which will, as a starting point, primarily look at the archives and the museum collections, because there is already some work that has been ongoing, and it's a case of sort of identifying what's there and what could fill in the gaps on the pages, or maybe we actually get an opportunity to do a little bit of discovery ourselves and maybe find something that hasn't been committed to paper or online before. And between us, we're going to be looking at strands of Black history, gender history, and LGBTQ plus history. And there's definitely something which occurs in my research and which is relevant here about how knowledge is held and how knowledge is shared, and how in the sort of online sphere that we're in now, there is so much access, but that in itself is quite, it can be a misleading term, it's a complex term. So I think we're looking at sort of releasing knowledge more freely and trying to really fill in those gaps. And in terms of LGBTQ plus history, there's been active suppression of those histories because of illegality, and it's been hard to keep those records at all. So it could be quite a tall order, it could be quite a large amount of work between us. I think we've discussed that we have 14 weeks, so we're probably going to end up being quite focused in some ways. But hopefully we will be able to identify new pieces of information and history and actively add those to pages on Wikipedia. So broadly speaking, we're looking to create new Wikipedia pages using content from the University of Edinburgh, which will, as a starting point, primarily look at the archives and the museum collections, because there is already some work that has been ongoing, and it's a case of sort of identifying what's there and what could fill in the gaps on the pages, or maybe we actually get an opportunity to do a little bit of discovery ourselves and maybe find something that hasn't been committed to paper or online before. And between us, we're going to be looking at strands of Black history, gender history, and LGBTQ plus history. And there's definitely something which occurs in my research and which is relevant here about how knowledge is held and how knowledge is shared, and how in the sort of online sphere that we're in now, there is so much access, but that in itself is quite, it can be a misleading term, it's a complex term. So I think we're looking at sort of releasing knowledge more freely and trying to really fill in those gaps. And in terms of LGBTQ plus history, there's been active suppression of those histories because of illegality, and it's been hard to keep those records at all. So it could be quite a tall order, it could be quite a large amount of work between us. I think we've discussed that we have 14 weeks, so we're probably going to end up being quite focused in some ways. But hopefully we will be able to identify new pieces of information and history and actively add those to pages on Wikipedia.
What would be most valuable to you to help your project expand or increase its impact?
I mean, I can obviously jump in here because I've probably got the most experience out of all of them, but in terms of the wiki side of things, but I guess they'll have their own thoughts about what would help them, which would be useful in as a newcomer almost, and what, you know, raising awareness for starters, I think would probably be something about why this is important, but also providing the tools to make it possible to onboard people, so that it becomes so that once people are motivated to get involved, that it's easy for them to get involved and stay involved. So a community of and tools and resources, I would say, but also having that why and that sort of intrinsic motivation within yourself to address knowledge gaps. That's the main thing. But I for me, the problem is that what would have helped me over the last 5 years is understanding that number one, not everything's online. A lot of people, there is this quote I like about when you turn on a tap, you expect clean water to come out. And when you do a search on the internet, you expect good information, basically. Good information to come out when you do a search. And what you find is what the web or certain algorithms are willing to show you or can show you. And that's obviously, you're not sure why that algorithm exists, or why that page exists, or why a page doesn't exist. You don't know what's missing until you do a bit of a deep delve into the subject area. And unless you're a subject expert, and not enough subject experts contribute to the online sphere. They're very focused on, in a university context, in a sort of reward culture that supports their work being driven towards paywalled journals. And it's about making the open web as inclusive and as representative and as factual and as neutrally factual as possible, so that people can fully inform themselves and fully educate themselves and fully feel included, that there are people out there that are like them or that they can be inspired by. So I think that's what I would hope for. It's a sort of a utopian view that sort of university culture could change to sort of looking at supporting their students and staff in understanding that contributing to the open web is actually a beneficial thing for everyone.
Yes, I remember in the project I did last year, it's definitely like a bit of a learning curve to get used to kind of the technical side of editing. But it was really nice the way we did it. We kind of did it were we in lockdown? I can't even remember now, it all seems a blur. But we did the sessions online in kind of a workshop context. And so we worked together in teams and we would kind of share our screens and go through it together. And Ewan was obviously on hand and was really helpful, giving us like tutorials for how to edit. And I think it was really interesting actually, like learning how to edit Wikipedia pages kind of highlighted some of the misconceptions that I had about Wikipedia as well, just in that, like, you know, you have to have these robust citations and you have to have this material that's been published elsewhere in order to state things. Also stuff about like neutrality and how you know, that was kind of difficult on some of the pages. I know you know, some people who were editing pages, there's a lot of back and forth between different editors. So people in our group who were editing pages and then people elsewhere that were editing pages. But I think that's really interesting because it's like kind of seeing the debates in action as they're being kind of played out in this digital space where people can all contribute. I'm excited to do the same again and learn like new things about being an editor. And I definitely think that was kind of like dipping my toes in. But obviously this is a much longer project. So I'm sure I'll get even more out of it this time.
There are two sides where you have to assess the content in Wikipedia and what's missing. And I don't know if that's always the easiest thing to do. And it would be helpful if there was ways of navigating Wikipedia and assessing its content. But that's obviously needs a lot of thought, because it's depends what you're looking to get out of it. I think Wikidata can help with that and ask quite bespoke questions of the information in Wikipedia. But there, assessing the Wikipedia content and what it's not got is one side of it. The other thing is, when we talk about not everything being online, and that there's loads of information in high quality books, journals, etc. Wikipedia doesn't really sort of use primary archival sources as source text. What it does is it needs people to have kind of written about those archival source texts first. So in some ways, we kind of need to make sure that what would be helpful is if there was a culture of making sure that the secondary sources that Wikipedia can cite are in existence in the first place. And that's where projects like Uncover Ed come in, because those students looked at the primary archival records about our global alumni and created the secondary source, a blog that documented that person's life. And it was the Uncover Ed page that we were able to cite in Wikipedia. So yeah, just a sort of culture that sort of, generates the secondary source, but also we need to sort of value the work that then goes into citing that source on Wikipedia and, getting it online. So there is a double labor there if that secondary source doesn't exist in the first place.
An interesting angle, but I didn't really know that an archival source has to be written about in order for it to go on Wikipedia. I thought
it's sort of, there's a number of reasons for it, because primary archival sources sort of can be sort of like quite written from a first person, like a letter, and you want to sort of like have that impartial view of it, or a diary. You want to have a historian's take on it, or scholars reviewing of that content, and then we cite that content. But yeah, there's from a historian's point of view, on like Dr. Louise Yeoman on the Witches Project, she argues that the primary material is everything, and that it's very problematic that Wikipedia doesn't easily allow you to cite the primary archival material, because what if you have a historian or a scholar that approaches that primary archival material and misrepresents it in their books, as has happened? And looking at accused witches of Scotland from non-feminist perspectives, for instance. And so but then I guess the argument would be that what you really need is like for a historian to look at the archival records and then write about them from feminist perspectives is probably what the Wikipedia editor's point of view would be to that. But yeah, it is a limitation, but there are reasons why Wikipedia doesn't sort of like it's willing to wait for someone to have reviewed the primary archival material first and then publish that content in a book or a journal or somewhere that we can then cite.
It's weird when you learn about Wikipedia from a perspective that isn't just Googling it. It's very different to kind of what you think it is, I guess. When you look at Wikipedia, to me, growing up, it was just you'd Google something and Wikipedia will always tell you the answer. I think within a university setting, it would be great to have just a further amplification of Wikimedia as like a source and also a place where you can put your knowledge. Almost it's like it being included within the university work that we do and the work we produce. Like as students, you're always producing work, often what feels like into a void, to kind of prove knowledge. And I know I had a friend last year who took a course where they actually produced Wikimedia, or they were writing blogs on Wikimedia. And I think kind of learning to A, produce something, and B, share that knowledge further out with the university circle is something that would be kind of great to see. I know that's kind of what Wikimedia and UN does at Edinburgh and are trying to do, but just kind of that further integration and also acceptance by uni spheres would be fantastic. And teaching students that you can share that knowledge that you learn out with and use those skills on a platform where they need that knowledge. There's so much knowledge that you learn at university that doesn't necessarily go online in accessible ways. So I think that would be kind of fantastic. And I guess that's further amplification or integration into various uni spheres, not just Edinburgh.
I would echo that point, because it's like a really good one. Because if you think about Wikipedia, I'm not sure what the current statistic is, but at one point it was like the second most viewed website during the pandemic. But I think it's around about between 5th and 8th most viewed websites normally in the world. And then you only have like somewhere in the region of 3,400 very active editors contributing and doing very active editing on Wikipedia, which is like about 100 edits a month or 100 pressings of the save button on Wikipedia a month. And 3,400 people is about the size of Kinghorn in Fife, or about half the size of North Berwick, trying to curate the world's knowledge that people that are accessing through Google quite a lot of the time as well. That relationship between Google and Wikipedia. And so really small community. So there are gaps, problems of pages not being as neutral or as representative as, or as up to date or from world perspectives as they could be. But if you think about somewhere in the region of 38,000 students at the University of Edinburgh and about 13,000 staff, and if even like a tiny percentage of those did some region of contributing, and that's really powerful impact immediately. And if that's one university, if you think about all the universities in the UK or in all of Europe or all of across the world, if a tiny percentage or even a larger percentage all saw Wikipedia as a resource, as a community resource, where you can share information and not worry. You can obviously worry about consuming, because that's healthy. About, you need to be able to cite what you write and verify what is written as well. Check where the validity of the source. Is it a reliable source? Great. But you can also write and contribute and become an active knowledge activist and improve the knowledge globally, and that's beneficial for a whole world community.
Yeah, briefly, I suppose there's something in this about changing the narrative. And I think it's been touched on a little in terms of talking about perspective, looking at LGBTQ plus histories and how they themselves challenge default norms that are reflected in our culture. There's a lot of meaning and value for me in reintroducing those stories and representation into Wikipedia, just because it's so globally recognized as a source of information that if it's not on there, it might be easy to assume that it doesn't exist at all, when it really does. And invisibility is quite a key term in relation to LGBTQ plus histories. So I think, there would be such an impact in making visible those histories, partly through the volume of stories we might be able to reintroduce, and also deepening the existing records that are already there.
What are you most proud of?
Oh, that's a hard one. I mean, I'm proud that we continue to do this work at Edinburgh, and we're one of the very few universities that is doing this work. And we're always finding new projects and new ways of engaging with the university community. And the project with Shan, Kirsty and Eleanor is just one example of that. And I always am really most proud of the fact that we have such positive experiences and that we do. I like the idea of Wikipedia as a paying knowledge forward model, where you're giving of yourself, of your time and your expertise and your passions, but it's sort of paying knowledge forward and releasing it into the wild, building on your learning, taking on the mantle of an expert is a phrase that was used in teaching when I was learning my teacher training. Having a student take on the mantle of an expert, teaching themselves about a subject, and then communicating it accessibly to the world and releasing it to the world so that people can build on that prior learning and expound on it and learn from it and run with it. And I think that's what my experience of at the university is. Once we engage with like different projects, we then want to share that experience, share what we've learned, and make it much easier for the next person to then find it a little bit easier to engage with, but also get inspired by, hey, they did that map of witches project, or hey, we've written about Scotland's suffragettes in that Histopedia timeline. Why don't we do something else, something that builds on that and does it that's a bit more ambitious again? Or why don't we reach out to this group and see if they can work with us? And it's a very collaborative space to be in. And there is a lot of brilliant people doing brilliant work. We just want to sort of connect the dots. And I think that's what Wikipedia is all about. It's connecting people. And it's about connecting them and seeing how their work relates to each other and relates to the world at large and can be accessed and learnt from and inspire people around the world.
I'm quite new to this work at the university, apart from having accessed it as an audience member, if you will. So I think I'm proud to be a part of it. I'm proud that it exists, that there is an active response to what's happening, that there is an acknowledgement that there are gaps and inequities, and that there is very much a sort of galvanizing kind of energy about, yes, we're going to address this and we're going to do something about that. And there's something quite empowering about that. And so I'm really pleased that these opportunities have been made available over so many years and so many sort of mini projects over this time, and sort of the ripple effects of what that might be.
I'm kind of the same. It's like, I mean, we're just starting off this week, and I'm really excited to kind of be included in this project, but it is that kind of, to even have this project and someone be looking to do this project and us all being, you know, given the opportunity to actually edit Wikipedia and make it a more inclusive space for everyone, I think is like something that's a massive achievement in terms of just recognition that the narrative that's currently online isn't necessarily the one that is the most accurate. And I think making space for all these people who have done all these amazing things is kind of something to be proud of in itself.
Yeah. So same, obviously, I was really happy to be part of the project last year. And I did feel a sense of pride, like when we published those pages, it was great to think, you know, what like future research they might inspire, or just kind of like generally things that people didn't know about Edinburgh University and their alumni and stuff. So yeah, I'm excited to see what kind of pages we make this time. And it's great to have like an active involvement in trying to address some of those inequities that exist online. So